I myself have it. I've got hypermobility. I have POTS. If I exercise too hard, I pass out. These patients are often made to feel worse by everyone around them, including their own family members. They'll say, "What's wrong with you? Everything's normal. Why aren't you getting better?"
Today I'm joined by Mr Jit Balakumar, well-regarded hip surgeon. Topics that we discussed include EDS, the hypermobile joint. It was a really insightful discussion that I had with Jit, so let's get on with it.
This cohort has hypermobility often, and their autonomic nervous system is supercharged. They're on sympathetic overdrive. And then following surgery, again, remembering that surgery is a controlled trauma, it actually almost throws fuel on the fire.
Yeah.
And these are patients you can tell almost immediately, day one post-op, their pain levels are heightened. They get swelling and they're looking at you like, what have you done to give me all this swelling?
Yeah.
And you yourself doubt yourself. You think, oh my God, there must be a bleed. You do investigations, there's nothing going on. Their hemoglobin's normal, but their whole leg is swollen. And as you know, sometimes I use photomodulation with laser light therapy. So one of the hypothesis in the knee is that we're damaging the lymphatics when we do knee replacements, and that's one of the reasons they swell for longer.
Yeah.
But similarly in the hip, I'm sure this happens, not damaging it, but we're creating some sort of trauma response to the lymphatics in that group of patients.
I would argue that you've got more a neuropathic response as well. I mean, we see people with CRPS. You measure the limb and it is swollen. It is swollen. It's a blood flow thing. You're right. I mean, is it a lymphatic thing? I don't know, but we see it all the time with knees, particularly. I very rarely see it with hips. I don't know if you've ever seen CRPS following a hip replacement. I can't think of anyone that I have. But then with the central sensitization, how much of it is autonomic? How much of it is neural swelling?
Look, it's hard to know because the lumbar sacral plexus is there.
Yeah.
We move the hip. I'm sure you've seen hip replacements into extreme positions. And again, I'm very cautious about this, and I definitely modify it. If I have someone who's hypermobile, in some ways they're easier to do the operation because you can take their hip into any position, right? And they're not as hard as a stiff arthritic hip.
Yeah.
But that's the warning and red flag for me. And we, as you know, in theatre, I often have the patient's history, the surgical prescription, but I also have warnings, and I get my fellows to put, if they're hypermobile, that every step of the way we have to be cautious with the range that we take them into.
Yeah.
So it could be central sensitization. It could be that we're giving them a lumbar plexopathy unknown to us for that range of motion that we're putting them through, which is normal for other people.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts on the hypermobile patient, the hypermobile joint? You've treated these patients for a long time. We work together. Just a reminder that this content is for educational purposes only. This is our opinion on the topics we discussed. Where are you at the moment?
Look, I think it's a very difficult group that gets treated less optimally by the medical profession, not because they mean to, but because we don't have the support services for them. So, I mean, look, I myself have it. I've got hypermobility. I have POTS. If I exercise too hard, I pass out.
Yeah, right.
And I've got a daughter with it, actually, a 10-year-old daughter who's about to have surgery.
Yeah.
She even says to me, "Daddy, are you even a real doctor?" Because she complains of all of her musculoskeletal symptoms, plus she gets fatigued and tired. So I think it needs a huge multidisciplinary team approach. In the UK, they've actually got a hospital devoted to this, right?
Yeah.
And it's a huge job for you or me to take on individually. I think the first step comes in education. We have to educate the patients that it's a multi-system problem, and at a cellular level that there's something that's happening that's potentially creating cellular problems with their collagen. Now, my colleague Ravi, who's the head of genetics at the Children's, he also sees a lot of these patients, and for him, they can do gene tests, but most of their gene tests are around the severe EDS. I think the ones we're seeing more is this benign hypermobility syndrome type 3. So they're going to test up normal on their gene tests, but they have these other symptoms, including gut, bowel, blood pressure, POTS, and it's very difficult to treat them because everyone's working in silos. So I think the first thing is we need to create a team, which you've done really well here, but even here in a private practice, it's a difficult setup.
Yeah,
and I feel like in the public sector is where they probably need some support. And because it's cellular, I actually think we need to be addressing their blood pressure issues early on. If you're not getting good perfusion to the limbs, you can't get good muscle patterning. Just like they get POTS, they're probably getting low brain perfusion, which again, it's going to go into protective mechanism and go away from the cortical representation of muscle patterning. And so they're more likely to decompensate early. Then, these patients, when I scope them, and again, I'm very cautious about scoping them. So if I just wanted to only have excellent outcomes, I'd say no to patients with EDS, and I'd say no to, a lot of people. But we're here to look after people, right? So every so often, I will be feeling like it's the right thing to do. We put them on the table, their hip just falls out. They've got amazing containment on their x-rays, they've got normal coverage, but it's so unstable, and you get a real representation of what they're going through on a daily basis. You look inside, their labrum is torn, not a huge tear, but their articular cartilage on the femoral and acetabular side has stripes, like a stretch mark. And so this, we define stability as when the hip is moving in physiological range and it's only rotating. But if there's translation, there's instability. So these lines are a sign of instability, and this is what they're dealing with on a daily basis. Their hip is not moving in rotation, it's translating, which means their synovium is being banged up against, which is innervated, which means they're getting inflamed in their synovium. So it has this huge flow-on effect. And then they lose normal muscle patterning, which then results in more macro instability. So they get micro instability and macro. But the question is, how do I treat them? I don't know. I use your help and your support. I think often really good physios can tap into them, and they would benefit from seeing someone who's a clinical pharmacologist. And the people who've been involved in that sort of space are also getting fatigued, because physicians and clinicians looking after these patients start with great enthusiasm, but over time they get tired because they feel like they're not making progress. They often come back. And so the way I've looked at it is, to me, God forbid, it's worse than cancer, EDS and hypermobility, because it's not visible. The disability is huge. And these patients are often made to feel worse by everyone around them, including their own family members. They'll say, what's wrong with you? Everything's normal. Why aren't you getting better? So I think getting them to understand that and then compartmentalize what they're going through, not to try to reach out to people who don't understand. They're often told, there's nothing wrong with you. They'll see a rheumatologist and they'll say, there's nothing, this is not EDS.
Well, the medical fraternity just gaslights them and sticks them out the door, basically.
Look, and I think that there's no doubt, if you and I could be made to go crazy, right? If someone keeps telling you there's nothing wrong with you. And these people eventually will end up with a mental health problem. And I think a lot of them do have it, but it's because of the situation and the circumstances. And we have to remember, it was not too long ago, I think it was in the 30s and 20s, doctors used to perform lobotomies, through an eye socket for people with mental health issues, right? So the mental health space is so badly treated. So not only is your hip instability difficult to treat, your low blood pressure and POTS difficult to treat, now you're in the space of, we don't even know if you've got a real problem. You could be functional neurological disorder. And to me, these are things that are happening at a cellular level. I think there will be a specialty called cellular medicine that'll evolve probably in the next 20 years. And I'm pretty convinced of this. I think it's going to start treating things like EDS, probably even osteoarthritis like Ozempic. They'll have a tablet or an injection that you can do. And I feel like that's the direction that eventually will help. But right now, besides supporting these people, getting their musculoskeletal system to be as stable as possible. So in the event of doing surgery, if I did do something surgical, I would get them to get, the anaesthetist on board. So I've been trapped early on where they've had a spinal, they've gone into autonomic collapse, spent 3-4 days just us chasing their blood pressure. So we pre-fill them, make sure they give if we're doing a spinal, very short acting without any vasomotor effects or something like Pralocaine. Make sure that they've been having electrolytes before, so sodium salts or some sort of salt electrolytes coming up to the surgery. I get them to get things like compression boots to really try to get their lymphatics working beforehand. Now, athletes use these things. Probably at a cellular level, this is what we need to get our hypermobility patients to do to improve perfusion to that area and to drain some of the inflammatory mediators out of the leg. And then also make sure they're linked in with a really good psychologist. They need support when they're going through the difficulties of surgery. During the surgery, we obviously are super cautious, even how we position their arm, how we move things. So these are the patients who can wake up with an ulnar nerve palsy or a brachial plexus palsy. It's not just the limb. And then post-surgically, whether it's a hip replacement or a scope or an osteotomy, I often put them in a brace. So I'm trying to improve their static stability by using some external splinting. Now, you could argue that bracing is preventing the muscle patterning, but I want to down-regulate their micro-instability so that they can get as stiff as possible.
I suppose you also want to quieten the nervous system down for a period, don't you?
And I think quietening the nervous system will help big time. There is a movement in the US, I'm sure you've seen this, there's opiate-free total knee and total hip, but they also align to it, they call it the quiet hip replacement or knee replacement. And there's some real merit to this, right? And I apply this to the hypermobility group. So we want to go quiet because early on your body perceives a trauma as trauma. It fights back with inflammation. So these are the patients I don't want them to have physio exercises day in, day out. So the quiet hip replacement or knee replacement in the US has all centered around doing no physio for 6 to 8 weeks. Very interesting, right?
Yeah.
And that is in conjunction with their opiate-free surgical pathway.
Yeah.
And the guy doing this, he's actually trying to get 1 million patients across the world.
Yeah.
He's definitely revolutionizing that space. His name is Andrew Wickline, but I use a lot of his principles for my hip replacements and knee replacements, but not to that extreme.
Yeah.
But for the hypermobility group, I think it's even more important, right?
Yeah. And they need preoperative assessment, preoperative pain management as well. We see a lot of patients on opioids, and we've got to, stabilize, get the opioids down, because throw opioids into the picture, and again, this is another big can of worms. It's a massive problem with opioid-induced hyperalgesia and what we call chemical coping. I'm in pain, I must take a tablet. And then they get into a bit of a loop, and you don't want that around this time of surgery as well.
Look, I think it's an interesting area, isn't it? Opioids. What do you think?
As little as possible. I would be absolutely for non-opioid based treatments because, and again, this is difficult to say, but I've been doing what I've been doing for 15, 20 years now. I've been injecting, I sometimes use neuromodulators, intrathecal pumps in a very small group of patients. None of those patients have died. The patients that die under our care or that we've seen are patients on opioids. If you take some opioids, you add it in with some mental health problems, then you add in psychiatric medications, and before you know it, patients have accidentally overdosed and died. I've seen it. I must have seen it, I think, 5 times in my career.
I'm pretty convinced opioids rewire your brain permanently, right? And I think it's the thing. So they're the ones you're seeing, but it's the non-visible problems we're creating with opioids that I actually am convinced is medicine's biggest problem, right? You and I have managed a lot of these patients. I feel like I dump them on you, but they've already come to us with a lot of opioids. So I say, Nick, can you help me? And in reality, I know it's a difficult problem for you. Even in your case, yes, you can get them off it. You might be able to use certain modalities, but their brain is permanently rewired. And all the things you talked about is an important piece. In some ways, it starts before us. The people seeing them, they're also, we all want to help people.
Yeah.
And they have a menu of options, and one of them is opioids. And I feel like opioids should not be one of the menu of options for the general medical population. If it was up to me, it would be only allowed to be prescribed by certain people. And that would create a huge problem, right?
Sure, yeah.
But if we need authority to prescribe antibiotics or specific antibiotics, I feel like the harmful effects of opioids are way greater that are non-visible.
Yeah. Remember that case we had 5-6 years ago, maybe a young lady, she was on 4 Endo a day.
Yeah.
And her mood was all over the place. She was depressed, she was up, she was down. You needed to do a hip replacement on her. We got her into hospital. We put her on some Suboxone, which just quietened her mood down almost to the 24 hours. She was settled. I then did a sacroiliac joint block, and I think I did a pulsed RF of a couple of nerve roots just to quieten down the hip area. And she flew through the hip replacement, and she was in her 20s, I think.
Yeah.
So it's a massive problem. The more I do this, the more I see it, the more I know opioids can be a big problem for some patients. They really can be.
And just to give your listeners a perspective, like if you had to compare opioids to a spinal cord stimulator, which has got a lot of bad publicity, right? So you've talked about the people who died.
Yeah.
But as we both know, there are in-between groups who are on large doses of opioids.
Yeah.
Which is worse? Because you talked about reversible, right? So
yeah. So which is worse in terms of?
In terms of long-lasting effects.
Opioids.
Like say a spinal cord stimulator had a complication.
Yeah. I mean, I practice it. I've had some complications. Infection is commoner than most. I've had one guy who got he was quite a big guy, got a dural tap. So I think I might have touched the S2 or S3 nerve root or nerve. And he had quite bad testicular pain for 3 or 4 months, but he had such good pain control. He wanted the stimulator and we put it in, and we've subsequently taken it out because his pain's gone away.
So opioids, and so I think, if your listeners could hear this out, and hopefully my mission would be that they come to you or to me without being on any opioids. It's not uncommon for patients to say to me, while I wait for surgery, what can I take? And I'm like, look, best is to do nothing.
Yeah.
These are arthritic patients, right?
Yeah.
Or Panadol.
Yeah.
Anti-inflammatories. And for me, anti-inflammatories are probably safer because it can be reversed if you have a ulcer, whereas paracetamol is kind of like drinking alcohol. You just can't see it. It has a cumulative effect on your liver.
Yeah.
And then beyond that, you just have to live with it. Now, that's a very hard thing for patients to take sometimes, but I would hope that some of what we're trying to show them is that some things are not visible, some of the side effects, and opioids is one of them, as a huge side effect. From your point of view, I would love to say, Nick, you're a pain specialist, right? So I see all these people who, if I'd offered them RFA, they're happy to have it from me. Whereas if I send them to you, they see it as, you know what, I'm seeing a pain specialist. There's a stigma attached to it. And I feel like there is a huge, not only are you treating people with non-mechanical pain, but there is a group of people you can treat, a huge group of people who have mechanical pain, like the ones we talked about. They're not the right time for surgery.
Yeah.
Or let's say surgeries that have less favorable patient satisfaction. You can't deny the data. So if we know you have a 30 to 40% dissatisfaction rate, I would say they've got real mechanical problems, but get them to see a specialist. And I would love that stigma to change around chronic pain specialists. You should be called musculoskeletal physician / pain specialist.
Yeah. Well, because we do both. There's no question about it. And I've seen so many people that come to us and go, I don't even know why I was referred to you. I thought you were going to give me opioids. And then we've gone through this whole strategy and opioids are not involved in the strategy, or we're going to talk about getting you down off opioids. That is a big thing. But that's part of the first consultation. It's a long consultation. It's about, and it sounds like you do the same thing, and I should make a pain specialist of you, not a hip surgeon, because I think, you're far more than a hip surgeon, because you talk about this stuff. You bring patients into hospital. You give them ketamine infusions. You manage, you're seeing the patient as a whole as opposed to just a joint.